Hi, my name is Madison Thiessen, and I've chosen to do my project on the Indigenous people of Brazil. While developing my research, I have uncovered many of the horrors that these people have suffered. I believe all of us know deep down what has happened, but until you read it over and over again, you truly don't understand. The pain that colonization has caused will live with these people forever. However, it is up to us to change the narrative. Through this research, I have seen a reoccurring theme, and that is that the non-Indigenous people have had an impact on the Indigenous way of life and not for the better. Despite the institutions in place, they still suffer. I would like to begin with their culture because I believe that understanding their way of life is essential to understanding the big picture. Each tribe has their own defining culture, and there are as many as 305 tribes today, which means roughly 900,000 people. There are as many as 40 or more language families grouped into three major language trunks: Tupi, Macroche, and Arawak. Despite having a variety of cultures, there are some recurring traditions that I have come across with my research. The Indigenous people survived on growing manioc or maize, hunting, fishing, and foraging. The Indigenous people are extremely skilled in the art of pottery, have an intricate oral tradition, and an extensive amount of knowledge of the environment. They often decorate their bodies with paint and rings and wear very little to no clothing. Much like most cultures, the Indigenous people of Brazil have their unique music, dances, and ceremonies for certain occasions. The flute music is very rare, and the women are not allowed to participate in this ceremony. The 16th century Tupi villages contained ocas, which were large, long houses made out of straw that could house multiple families. 50 married men with their wives and children could fit in these houses. To stay warm at night, the Indigenous people would sleep in hammocks near the fire. Now, when meeting the Indigenous people, it is safe to say the Europeans did not believe that their way of life was civilized. They believed that those without clothing should feel shame, and that they were corrupt for not worshiping God. They believed that being white meant they were superior from the start, and this leads to much conflict later on. This is Chiate at 80 years old. He was the chief of the Zerente people, and according to Lankford, he resisted colonization for many years. Some of the Zerente people were conquered, and others migrated west. Colonization has had an impact on not only the Indigenous people of North America, but the Indigenous people around the world. For the Indigenous people of Brazil, contact has only led to misery and pain. 11 million First Nation and 2,000 tribes once lived peacefully in what we know now as Brazil. When coming into contact with the Europeans, nearly 90% of those people died from diseases such as measles, smallpox, or influenza. The minimal resources that the Europeans did give were then cause for conflict between tribes. By the 1640s, colonization truly took hold. The Indigenous people were then forced into slavery, becoming the main source of labor in the New World, first as dyewood harvesters, then as plantation laborers. This evidently played into the slave triangle as discussed in class. Those who resisted the crown were then slaughtered to make room for supposed civilized nations. Soon the Portuguese realized they must assimilate the Indigenous people to succeed. Many Indigenous peoples were then placed on parks, which is what we know in North America as reserves. Often, many tribes were placed on these parks, very close together. This land was often infertile and led many to starve of hunger. The missionaries first arrived in Brazil in 1549. In comparison to most of the interactions with the Portuguese people, the missionaries had a passive way of interacting with the Indigenous people. Through time and dedication, they had learned the indigenous languages and preached to the indigenous people using their traditional song and dance. With this, they were successfully converting them into Christianity. Many were attending church and praying. Through preaching, the missionaries attempted to correct certain cultural aspects that they believed to be sinful. They insisted on the discontinuation of cannibalism of any sort and encouraged true marriages rather than polyamorous lifestyle of the indigenous people. Just like most Europeans who came into contact with the indigenous people, the missionaries carried diseases with them, spreading them through tribes. Evidently, they would not blame this on themselves, but rather a punishment from God for Indian immorality and inconstancy. In the beginning, there was a sort of peace between the missionaries and the indigenous people. In fact, they advocated against the slavery of Indians. But once they realized that the First Nations no longer wanted to be converted and continued with their cannibalistic and polyamorous rituals, they turned to violence. The Jesuits then supported military action, and the independent villages were soon destroyed. 4 to 5 independent villages were to be blended together. There they would be supervised and controlled by the Jesuits and forced to follow Portuguese law. These were known as aldeias. The larger the aldeias became, the more diseases spread. People were dying at an intense rate. Once again, the cause of this, the diseases brought from Europe. Despite the incredible losses that the aldeias suffered, the Jesuits still believed that it was their duty and responsibility to convert the indigenous people. I believe the non-indigenous people throughout time struggle to recognize the devastating impact they have had on the indigenous people around the world. Those in power are so caught up in their own endeavors that human rights go by the wayside. The people are forced to make way for development like roads, fields, mines, and more. They are placed on parks, and this leads to unwelcome visits from non-indigenous people, viewing them almost as animals in the zoo. There's extreme deforestation of their lands and the exploitation of their resources. Often, any programs put in place to make some sort of difference are not supported by the large companies and landowners to truly have an impact. SPY, the Indian Protective Services created in 1910, was developed to hush the indigenous people who had enough of the tormenting. The institution participated in the many years of genocide and was then torn apart in 1967. Then there was the creation of FUNAI, the National Indian Foundation. This institution was just as corrupt and toxic as its predecessor. There's long-lasting effects to what the non-indigenous people have done. Today, much like the First Nations of North America, the Aboriginal people of Brazil lack a sense of identity, turn to liquor to soothe their pain, and are forced into prostitution or begging to survive. These people are not only disconnected from their language and culture, but are forced to tolerate racism from those who caused this disconnect in the first place. Much like the First Nations of Canada, people have begun to rise up against this discrimination. The Brazilian government, even today, supports the industrialization of the Amazon, the mining of indigenous lands, and the deforestation for the growth of agriculture. In fact, there are indigenous leaders that are being murdered for this cause. But the people say no more. There are roughly 200 organizations fighting for the rights of the First Nations people, recognizing that these lands, used for such development, are not theirs to control.